One of the difficult and confusing aspects of learning Chumash, I don't know how many of us actually think about it, but when we're trying to analyze personalities, in the Torah, we can even go back as far as the beginning. And we have Adma Rishon, the Bechir HaNivraim, the man that Hashem himself, B'chvaydu B'atzmoi Hashem, forged, and his two children. You have Cain and Hevel, and one of the sons a murderer. We go on later, Avram and Lot, and Lot's Avram Avinu's Talmud Muvok, you could say. When he left Haran and came to Eretz Yisrael, the only two people that he came with was his wife, and his close relatives was his wife and his nephew. Lot, aside from those other people, that Nefesh Asher Asu B'Charan, his Talmudim that he made in Haran. But as far as traveling with family, somebody who was his close Talmud, his Talmud was Lot. And yet we see Lot's end, and the end of his progeny was never to come into Klal Yisrael. So here you have somebody who was so involved, so deeply involved in his life with that of our forefather Avram, only to come to this tragic end where his family, Lot's family, can no longer associate with the mishpacha, the chosen family. Lavan, again, here we have Avraham Avinu decides to send Eliezer to find a wife for Yitzchak, and where does he go? To the house of Lavan. Rivka turns out to be the mother of Klal Yisrael, and yet the Torah says, Arami Oved Avi, that here you have Lavan, who comes from that family, and he wants to destroy the family that his sister built. So we get to the different personalities in the Torah, and we find an enormous contradiction over here, that on the one hand, you have great personalities, great families, that in the end, instead of bonding with the mishpacha, with the chosen family, they start out that way, and then something happens, and just the opposite takes place, where they become distant to the point where they can no longer associate. So it's very difficult to understand when you're trying to comprehend the Torah and trying to understand these personalities. And we're going to discuss today Yaakov and Aisev to some extent. How do we put all this together? How do we understand it? That something that was started out so close could end up being so distant. How do those two things actually come together? How do we understand this? So really there's two approaches how to look at this. We could really say that when things are not so critical, we look at ourselves and we try to be better people, especially at this time of year. We make an effort, but we know to some extent who we are, and we're kind of little people trying to do the right thing. So therefore, the consequences, the ramifications of our actions in the bigger picture, although everything does have an influence, but we understand that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us a lot of space and a lot of time how to correct, to give us the opportunity to correct the things that we need to correct, because ultimately we're dealing with things that are not earth-shattering and so critical to the existence of the world and the existence of mankind. Of course, we have no right to see it that way. We have to look at ourselves, and like the Rambam says, that every action that we do can actually tip the scales, especially at this time of year. It can tip it for the better, for the worse. But we still know that in the bigger picture, given who we are, that, and again, this is with the idea we're trying to improve ourselves, we're trying to be better, trying to have more of an influence on ourselves and the people around us. Still at the same time, our influence is to some extent limited. When you come to Avram and Lot, two people that had a great impact and great effect on the world, so their actions, everything that they did was much more meaningful. So in the final analysis, the little movement that Lot made away from his mentor Avram had enormous consequences, enormous ramifications. One way to look at it. And therefore, when it comes to bigger people, every little thing that they do is critical. Another approach is, this is something that always bothered me also. You look at Tzaddik and Baisus. Very interesting in Mishnayos at Pirkei Avos. It says there that a Mishnah, it says, out to you, avodim hamshamshim es harav lekabel pras. Right? Don't be an eved that serves your master for the purposes of reward. But do it l'shem shamayim, and the sofa kavod lavo, in the end, in any event, Hashem will bless you. So how could it be that you have Tzadok and Baisus being Talmidim of a certain great personality, and they hear these words, and from these two men come out splinter movements in Klal Yisrael, but they actually split off from the mainstream of Klal Yisrael and actually establish a new religious outlook, which is maybe more Torah Shabbat oriented than Torah Shabbat oriented. How does that happen? How does such a change take place? I mean, whatever they were taught, I can imagine if they were students of Tanoim, students of the Zugos, it's certain that they were Talmidei Chachamim on some level, and when they heard the Rebbe saying, serve Hashem l'shem shamayim, and don't do it for reward. I mean, we sit around the table, maybe we pay only lip service to this idea, but all of us understand that the tachlis of our life is the next world, is Olam Haba. Everything that we do now is in preparation for a bigger, more promising future. So if we understand that, maybe we're not integrating that in our minds and our hearts sufficiently, but if we do understand that that is the truth, certainly the Talmidim, these Talmidim, Tzaddik and Baisus, they certainly understood that. So why was it that they eventually developed into a splinter movement and broke away from the mainstream of Klal Yisrael? It's very difficult to understand. So I think you have to understand it in this way. And I think this is how we're going to go into the approach of how we look at, to some extent, the differences between Yaakov and Aisev. I think the way that you have to approach it over here is this. Certainly, the Talmidim, these two Talmidim, Tzaddik and Baisus, when they heard this statement from their Rebbe, unquestionably, they didn't question what the Rebbe said. Of course, it's understood that Olam Haba is our destination, and therefore we should focus more on serving Hashem for the right reasons to serve Hashem in order to be a pure servant of God, and not look only towards the reward. But what happens sometimes when you want to teach people the proper approach to life? Sometimes what happens is a certain point gets overemphasized, and sometimes people in the course of life, from generation to generation after that, people start to feel, well, maybe a little bit bogged down with Yiddishkeit. They feel it's like kind of a heavy weight on their shoulders, and it doesn't seem like, that it's paying off to the extent that they would like it to pay off, to the extent that would make it more meaningful for them. People go through the different periods of history, and people go through different situations, poverty, other things that times of persecution and oppression that over our history that we've suffered. And as a result of that, people start to feel sometimes a little bit that Yiddishkeit may be a little bit of a burden upon them. It's more of an obligation than a joy. And that feeling, when it starts off that way, even subtly, and if it's not watched, as time goes on, the sense of that gets stronger and stronger to a point where you have now Tzaddik and Aisev, 3-4 generations later, and it's not just the question of, the father teaching the son, well, listen, it's very, very important to know that the Iker Tachlis of your life is Olam Haba, and that's how you have to live. But then what happens is, the kids only hear that, that life is learning Torah, doing mitzvahs, and regardless of what state of financial state you live in, if it's poverty, not poverty, whatever it is, you got to do it, and it becomes kind of mechanical, and then the children lose sight of the beauty of religion, and as a result, they broke away into another movement that wasn't so disciplined and so demanding. So in other words, what I'm saying is that over a course of time, period of a few generations, if a father, grandfather, great-grandfather picks up on a Torah idea and subtly conveys it not exactly in the way that it was taught, eventually down the road what happens is that it really, from the difference being so minute, the difference starts to develop to be greater and greater and greater, till actually what happens is, in the case of Tzaddik and Aisev, a new movement actually came about. And when we think about Yaakov and Aisev, I think that in a certain respect also we have to see them in the same light over here. It's impossible to imagine, when we're children and we go to Cheder, everything has to be polarized. There's no such thing as telling a child, Aisev was not such a bad guy, he really was a tzaddik, but in this sense he was a rasha. You can't do those kind of things with kids. Kids get confused when you teach lessons like that. So what you do, you have to polarize and say, Yaakov was a tzaddik, and Aisev was a rasha. But if it was so apparent, what happened with Yitzchak? Why didn't Yitzchak chap it? Why didn't he realize who his son Aisev was? Evidently, Yitzchak was a very, very, very smart man, our forefather. And if he didn't chap it, must be that it wasn't so apparent. So the question is then, when we say Aisev was the rasha, what do we mean? And when we say that Aisev symbolizes the Roman culture, the culture of today, which is the Gentile mentality, the Gentile culture, what are we really saying? And we talk about the world today, we talk about Aisev. Aisev is the Shemesh, Aisev is the sun, and the Jewish people are the moon. So what are we really saying when we're talking about Aisev as being the Gentile culture of the world? Like I said, if his father recognized that midah in him, He would have done the same thing that Avraham Avinu did to Yishmael. Of course with a heavy heart, but he would have escorted him out the door. Can't have a child like that around the house, especially influencing Yaakov. So that's how we have to see it, that in the course of the events of history, as Aisev deviates in some small way from the path of his father and his mother, the traditions of his father and his mother, then it starts to, this path, this narrow path starts to widen, and the bridge, the gap between Yaakov and Aisev becomes wider and wider and greater and greater. There was always a question, you look at there's a sefer called the Bir HaShmuel. Bir HaShmuel is one of the great Torah leaders before the Second World War. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva in Kamenetz. And in one of his books, one of his Sfarim, I can't remember his Perish on Kiddushin, he has an introduction there where he discusses Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and the life of the Jewish community in Germany at the time. And he has a whole long piece of Torah over there about how that way of life cannot come to Poland, cannot come to Eastern Europe. Everybody knows that the Bir HaShmuel had the highest regard for Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. When he wrote such a polemic, it wasn't in any way to attack the greatness of that man. But one of the things that he wrote there is that the concept of chut hameshulash b'mehera lo yinatek, when you have a father, a child, and a grandchild, you have 3 generations of Talmidei Chachamim in the house, that continues the tradition from generation to generation. In other words, what he was saying was that he was concerned about the fact that in a community where the goal of the family, the father, is to see to it that a child remains religious, that he remains on some level of Yiras Shamayim, and doesn't strive that his child should be a Torah scholar, be a Talmid Chacham. In the end result, as time goes on, the whole idea of Judaism cools down. In other words, it's not going to be one generation, it's not going to be 2 generations, but if the goal of the father is not to see to it that his children should be Talmidei Chacham, should only be from Jews, eventually what happens is even the frumkeit goes away, because that's the way it is. From generation to generation, you cool off a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, till eventually the space in between the way the great-grandfather was and the great-grandchild over a number of generations, that's the way it is. I went to the wedding of one of my cousins, and both sides of the family, the grandmothers both covered their hair, and the grandson at the wedding didn't wear a yarmulke, and the bride was totally unsneezed. She wasn't dressed in a wedding dress for 2 generations. 2 generations from 2 people that covered their hair. And why? Because they had the right externality, the right idea, but it didn't carry over from one generation into the next because Torah wasn't involved. To learn Torah and understand Torah, to understand the importance of that way of life was not part and parcel of the education of transmitting the Masorah from one generation to the next. So that's what the Bir HaShmuel was saying. It starts out small, and as time goes on, the gap between the previous generations and the later generation grows and grows. So that's the same idea over here. We're not going to look at Aisev as a personality that his father couldn't be proud of. Definitely not. But that subtle difference between Yaakov and Aisev eventually became an enormous difference between the two. And as time went on, to such an extent that Aisev became the man that represented Gentile culture as opposed to Yaakov Avinu. that represented the Torah personality. Now, when we're going to go through some of the psukim over here in the Parsha in order to understand actually where this began. However, we must understand, this is a very, very fundamental point also. Secondly, is that we can never attribute to Aisev a situation where his role in this world was preordained. Otherwise, the fundamental principle of our life, which is Bechira, is lost. Concerning her predicament, it says, that already from the womb they were separating from one another. So what does this mean? If it doesn't mean that this was their true nature, and Aisev did have Bechira, why is the Torah telling us this? So the answer is that this was Hashem's way of separating Aisev from Yaakov. His way of separating Aisev from Yaakov at a very, very young age. Because first of all, Aisev was the older brother, and because Aisev was older than Yaakov, the younger brother has a tendency to follow after the older brother, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to make it number one to see to it that Yaakov wouldn't be influenced. They already had to part ways at such an early point in life. Number one. Secondly, what was another reason why? Rivka had to be aware of the differences between Yaakov and Aisev. Why? Because most of the time what happens is it's difficult to know, it's difficult to see a child's true nature in the beginning. Right? Sometimes it takes time. When kids grow up, you really can't understand right away. And even in a house of Yitzchak and Rivka, it wouldn't have been so easy to recognize because the parents influence the children in a certain way, and especially when they're young, they tell them what to do. So it's very difficult to know what the true nature of a child is till much later. But in the case of Yaakov and Aisev, this would have been a critical problem. And therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Rivka the knowledge of the difference between the two of them at a very early stage in their lives, so she would be aware and protect Yaakov from fraternizing with Aisev, and also protect Yaakov to see to it that he would develop in the proper way. Now you notice there's something here that's very amazing. The fact that she had this unusual pregnancy, she went to Yeshivas Rabbi Akiva, and her whole view that something here was out of the ordinary was reinforced by the prophecy of these great men. And still in all, she didn't bother to tell it to Yitzchak. She didn't tell Yitzchak what happened. Yitzchak was still under the impression that Aisev would be the chosen one of the two sons. Now, if she had this information, why didn't she take it to Yitzchak? That he would also, not only her, but Yitzchak would also protect Yaakov from the influences of Aisev. So, certainly we have to say that she took it as a particular prophecy that was given to her. And she was supposed to know this in order to protect Yaakov from Aisev. But on the other hand, Yitzchak was actually challenged and tested by Aisev's greatness. She didn't expose it because she understood she wasn't supposed to expose it to Yitzchak. Yitzchak was supposed to deal with Yaakov and Aisev by not knowing this knowledge. And as we see, amazingly, because of that, Yaakov had to steal the birthright from Aisev, and because of that, he had to run away to Lavan to save his life, because of the fact that Yitzchak understood wrongly, in a misguided way, that Aisev was supposed to be the chosen one. So we notice over here that that even after many, many years, Aesav's true nature and true personality and who he was not even revealed fully to his father. And only because at the time of the bracha it says that Chazal tell us that Yitzchak saw Gehenna open, the gates of Gehenna open in front of Aisev. He was convinced that, he said, Gam Baruch Yeh, that the blessing should also be given to Yaakov, and therefore he gave the blessing as well. But without Hashem making him privy to that knowledge at that time, then perhaps his bracha for Yaakov wouldn't have been the same.
Rabbi Weiss, I mean, even the parsha before the bracha is given, when Aisev marries from Canaanim, so it says Morav Ruach Yitzchak again to Rivka. So we saw.
It's relative. It's relative. Yitzchak saw what he did. It definitely disappointed him on some level, but he gave his son the benefit of the doubt.
He gave him latitude.
He gave him the benefit of the doubt and latitude that he had a good reason for what he did. That's our assumption over here. And this clearly was a test. It was an assignment for Yitzchak. Now to enhance this point, we have to look at how Aisev was born in relation to Yaakov. Torah says, Vayetze harishon admoni, kulo kaderes seyor, vayikru shmo Aisev. Aisev was born first. He was born ruddy, hairy like an adult. Now, again, these were signs of kulo kaderes seyor, means like a hairy garment. These were signs to Yitzchak of unusual development, of incredible potential. I mean, here's a child that comes out, born like an adult. Everything that happened, now Yitzchak, he recognized everything. That's the way this family was. Aside from recognizing everything as hashgacha pratis, they were so sensitive to everything in their lives because they knew that they represented the future. Everything was a portent for the future. So when Yitzchak was born this way, it only emphasized more in Yitzchak's mind that where Aisev was going to go in the future. And the truth of the matter is, it's true. Aisev was given a tremendous koach over here. It was a sign of power and leadership. And we see that even in the world today. Aisev representing his influence, his mentality, his personality is associated with the Umas Olam, with the great power of the Gentile world today. But because his dominance is so great, mankind is unable as a result to recognize the falsehood of his ways. Like we say, Chazal compare Aisev to the sun, and Yaakov is compared to the moon. Now, had Aisev used that koach in a different way, then in fact he would have been the manik of the world. Hashem gave him, he came into the world with enormous potential. We see just the other way by Yaakov Avinu. When it came time to get the bracha, what does Yaakov say? Vanochi ish chala. He wasn't born hairy, he wasn't born ruddy, he wasn't born with that power. He was born with a more passive kind of personality. Vayetzi Arishon Admoni Kulu Kaderes Seyor Vayikru Shemo Aisev. They called him Aisev because he was made. He was a self-made already from that point. He was a made human being. Aisev Miloshin Asu. The verse says he was so hairy at birth, like an animal. Later in his life, the Torah states, he settled in Seir. Seir, also the same Lashon, from the same Shirish. An allusion to hair, and also a description of a he-goat. Now Yitzchak interpreted this as a sign of his boldness as a goat that leads the flock. He would be a leader in the service of Hashem. That's how Yitzchak saw Esau. And unquestionably, as we know, Rashi explained to us, Yodei Atzayid, that Asa was a man that knew how to speak. He knew how to convince his father, and maybe even convince himself of his true greatness. However, the other side is that he would be bound to his animalistic side. When we compare him to the Seir, when we compare him to that, it could be that, and again, this was something that was Esav's choice. Anything that we say about Esav, we're Iber Chachamim. When we're saying these things, we're looking at it in hindsight, and now the Torah is telling us that where it all started. It started in the womb of Rivka, when the division between these two personalities began. But all this, as I said, is being said in hindsight. And looking back, now that we see who Aisev turned out to be, now that we see who Yaakov turned out to be, now we understand a little bit better where it all comes from. But initially, it wasn't understood. The nations, as exemplified by Aisev, they chose this world. They are like creatures that follow their instincts to gratify their physical desires. That was Aisev, Miloshin Sa'ir. He adopted the more animalistic side of existence. Yaakov, on the other hand, was smooth. He represented the human model in the true sense. Even at the time when he had to acquire the birthright, he claimed to his mother, Anochi Ish Chalak.
Chalak can also be straight.
You're right. Another drawback, how in terms of Esav's life, sometimes it can happen that a child, because of the fact that a child is given more in the beginning, it turns out to be detrimental to his development. When somebody's the firstborn, more masculine, it prevents him from sensing the frailty and vulnerability of his childhood existence, and which is what usually humbles a child to listening to his parents, to being more amenable to instruction. But if a child who's a little bit more, a little stronger in personality, he feels more his oats, and very often he's more stubborn and unable to listen. And as we see in the development of these two children, it says, "Vayigdalu hanarim," they grew up, and Aisev became an Ish Sadeh. So of course, from the children, we understand that an Ish Sadeh means a man of the field, means he goes out there, he's a hunter. This was all part and parcel of who he was. But we can really understand the concept of an Ish Sadeh is a man who's a philosopher. In other words, he also sat with his father and his mother and he learned. But Yaakov was an Ishtam Yoshev Halim. He was a person that to him the most important thing was not his view of the world. He wasn't just going to use his parents' ideas as a springboard to develop a philosophy of life. Yaakov his whole mindset was meshubah to the teaching he was subservient to the teachings of his father and his mother. Whereas Aisev was more of a philosophical man in the sense that he gained certain things from his parents and then he went out to the field to meditate. And he brought his own ideas in from his own mind, which is what is philosophy. Philosophy is, for example, you had a book out many years ago, a big book, the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Very interesting book. Very interesting book. He started out with a whole foundation of premises and built a whole logical building on a foundation of certain premises. So by Yaakov, his mind, the way he was learning from his father and his mother was that he would adopt all the premises from them of how to live, and from there he would build his building on that. Whereas in Aisev's case was, although he did learn much from his parents, but at the same time, it all depends what premises you begin with. If you start with the right premises as your foundation, then you build a logical building, a logical religious building on top of that, so then everything follows logically and correct. So Yaakov didn't want to take any chances, so everything that he learned, he stood by his parents until he understood every possible premise properly, and then he would build his building on that. Whereas Aisev gained certain fundamental ideas, and then he became an Ish Sadeh. He went out there on his own to figure out a way of life that he would trailblaze. And in that way, again, as time went on, the difference between the Masorah that Yitzchak and Rivka presented to Yaakov was today the difference between the Gentile mentality and the Jewish traditional mentality in the world. And we see how something starts off, and the difference is fundamentally quite subtle, and as time goes on, that building, when you start out with a little bit of a different set of rules, different set of premises, then the theories part ways more and more as time goes on. And here you have two worldviews, two incredible worldviews. Aisev is a giant in one way, and the tremendously great things, great accomplishments that the Gentile world does for mankind. But as far as being the chosen element, which is fundamentally, and this is the point that we have to understand more than anything right now at this time of year, before standing before Hashem on Yom Kippur, is that we are not the Soyer. We are not we are not Vayetze Arishon Admoni Kulo Ke'aderes Seir. We are not the one that lives by our instincts. And our instincts are very much a part of us. They're part of our nature, and they're second nature to us. But we are expected, and what makes us the chosen people is that we are able to rise above our fundamental instincts and make choices, even though they're very difficult and go against our nature. Still in all, we are asked and demanded of us, and that is the essence of our tshuva. The essence of our tshuva on Yom Kippur is to be able to rise above our physicality and let our unique spirituality, our neshamas, shine forth, and to be the truth, as I always describe it, as an angel in the form of a human being rather than an animal in the form of a human. And that's the fundamental difference between us and the Gentile world. Wisdom, like the Gemara says, Chachma b'bayim tamim. But to understand the concept of the tikkun, the real tikkun, which is to transform the human element, the body, the physicality, the animalistic side of ourselves, and transform that into a spiritual being, the only way to accomplish that is following the traditions and the Masorah that we have from Yitzchak, Rivka, and Yaakov. any deviation from that, we will not be able to accomplish that goal. May we be Zoichem Yirtz Hashem on Yom Kippur. To be, that's what we say, that Yom Kippur is a day that we don't eat, we don't drink, we stay in shul all day. May we be Zoichem, at least for that day of the year, to live our lives like Malachim. Yirtz Hashem, and Hashem should forgive us, and we should have each and every one of us have a great year and a great future.